Hi, I'm Geoffrey Miller, and we are here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in my basement studio with three of my sex researcher, sex educator friends. And what's distinctive about this conversation is we all have PhDs in psychology, but we don't take that too seriously. And we've all done sex research. I think we all teach psychology of human sexuality classes called One Thing or Another. And we all, in one way or another, kind of have one foot in academic research and academic teaching, but another foot in popular outreach, training, coaching, helping clinicians and therapists understand people's sexuality and relationships, or stuff of that sort. I thought it might be fun to have a look at what is the state of sex education and sex research in America. What's it like to kind of try to bridge that gap between academic research and public outreach? And what do we all think about the future of that kind of academic and public bridging and what's going to play out in the next 10 or 20 years? So I guess I'll ask each of you maybe to introduce yourselves briefly. Maybe Justin first.
My name is Justin Lehmiller. I'm a research fellow at the Kinsey Institute. I run a blog called Sex and Psychology. I have written a textbook on human sexuality as well as a recent book on the science of sexual fantasies, and that's kind of what I do.
I'm Diana Fleischman, and I'm currently on sabbatical from my job at the University of Portsmouth, and I taught psychology of human sexuality, and with my PhD, I did some research on the interaction of disgust and sexual arousal in women, and also with one of my graduate students, I looked at the same phenomenon. The idea is that sexual arousal reduces disgust sensitivity. We found mixed results on that in women, and I just have an interest in sexuality. I taught human sexuality for many years, and it's a fascinating topic, and I think one topic that has huge importance for people's lives and people don't talk about openly enough.
My name is Dr. Zhana Vrangalova. I'm an adjunct professor of human sexuality at New York University, and I do a lot of other kinds of teaching, writing, coaching, and speaking, specifically about consensual non-monogamy, casual sex, non-heterosexuality, and other edgy-ish topics.
So Justin, you're in town in Albuquerque this weekend for the Sexual Health Alliance. They have a weekend training, I understand, for mostly clinicians and therapists who are in practice trying to help people understand sex and relationships. One thing I've noted in a lot of graduate training programs is there's very little coverage of human sexuality. I think that's fair to say at most universities. It might surprise ordinary folks to realize how little training there is. So organizations like Sexual Health Alliance try to kind of fill that gap. That's what you're in town for. How did the weekend go, and what were your impressions of the state of that kind of educational mission?
I mean, it was great. It was exhausting because it was 16 hours of me teaching about the science of sex. But it's the seventh time and seventh city where I've put on this workshop. So I travel around the country teaching therapists, clinicians, educators what they need to know about sexual fantasies in particular. But we do cover a range of topics in the workshop. And I think that the work that we do is really important here because there is no requirement if you're training in psychology to get a certain amount of sex education, which is kind of surprising and also kind of sad because sexual complaints are one of the single biggest reasons people seek out a counselor or psychologist in the first place. Yet what often happens is people take one course in their entire graduate career that's supposed to teach them everything they need to know about sex.
And that often goes for relationship therapists as well. So some of the marriage and family therapy programs, master's programs usually will have almost no sex education, even though practically the vast majority of couples coming in for couples therapy of some sort are going to be there for some sort of sexual, or that is going to be part of the issue.
And people can claim that they treat that or that they focus on that or specialize in it, but it doesn't mean they have the training, which is why it's important if you're somebody who's seeking out professional help that you look for somebody who's certified in that area so that you're sure that they've had a certain amount of training.
So what would ordinary folks be looking for in a clinician therapist, even a primary care physician, in terms of finding a professional who actually can deal with their sex and relationship issues? Maybe particularly if they're not sort of vanilla mainstream, if they have some unusual relationship patterns or preferences.
I mean, what I would say would be to look for a therapist who's certified by a sex-positive organization, meaning one that respects sexual diversity. So one organization that offers this certification is ASECT, the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. I might have gotten the order of that wrong.
That's
but,
right.
but they are informed by science and offer certification and take a view that is not going to be pathologizing to people who might have interests in kink or consensual non-monogamy. And so you want to look for somebody who's certified by ASECT or through the Sexual Health Alliance who's gotten that sex positive kind of training.
Or there is sort of a list of kink aware professionals out there. So KAP, kink aware professionals, people can Google that. And there's a big list that's being kept about not just counselors and therapists, but all sorts of professionals who are aware of kink, at least in their work. So they're not going to be stigmatizing of kink, but most of those people are also quite familiar with all sorts of non-traditional sexualities and relationship styles. So that's a good resource for anyone who doesn't fit the vanilla profile.
Just remember that not all therapists are created equal, and you got to do your research and homework before you settle on one.
And to be fair, a lot of that when you're working with a therapist is about the fit between you and this person. So I've actually found people who have many letters behind their name who you go to, or other people that I've sort of connected with or sent to different people, and they just don't connect with that person and there's no good fit. And then they go to someone who doesn't have many letters, but they do have some experience and some knowledge, and for whatever reason, their personality fits this person. And so there's that too. So do your research and go see a few people, I would say, before settling on who you're going to be working with.
What's some signs of a good fit? Because I've only ever seen an individual therapist a couple times when I was a teenager. I've actually never sought out a therapist. What's a good fit? What is it? What you just like have a good rapport, or you enjoy hearing the person's advice, or whatever?
Yeah, I think there's that's more of a feeling than anything. So I think it's important what Justin was saying. Make sure that they have the expertise that you need, right? That they can work with the populations that you are one of, or with the issues that you're struggling with. So if you have, I don't know, sexual desire discrepancy with your partner, you want someone who knows how to deal with that and is maybe certified by some of these associations. But then the rest is just feeling. Do you like spending time with this person? Do you trust this person? Do you think they're competent? Do you feel like...
I can imagine that could cause a lot of conflict in a couple, especially like let's say there's a desire discrepancy and you go to one therapist who says, you really need to dial it down. And the other therapist says, you really need to dial it up. And be like, oh, I have a strong preference for this therapist. Yeah.
And I think there's a little bit of an analogy here that if you have a particular mental disorder that might be treatable by psychiatric medication, you often have to try a bunch of different meds in sequence at different, dosages, and find out about the side effects and kind of push through the initial few weeks of side effects and then see how it works. The difference is, if you're trying out different meds, the med's not going to get offended if you leave it. Whereas a lot of people are weirdly worried, if I start with the therapist's going to be kind of distressed that even though they hate me and my politics and my sexuality, I should just tough it out and stay with them. No, drop them, move on. And I think it's also important to realize, let's say clinical psychology PhDs are actually fairly well trained to deal with LGBTQ issues. That's part of the kind of mandatory American Psychological Association training, but they're not required to learn about kink, consensual non-monogamy, but there's also often kind of a leftist political bias in psychology departments. So you also have a failure to train, about Mormon or Jewish or
Christian,
Muslim or Christian, Protestant, evangelical, Catholic sexuality, or if you're a libertarian or conservative or whatever. So it's really important, I think, to find a therapist who at least is a little bit understanding and sympathetic to the deep, moral and political and religious convictions that you have. Because
Agreed.
many therapists they'll pretend, but they don't really get it. Okay.
Yeah. So I tell people will sometimes come to me because I do some coaching specifically around not monogamy or casual sex, like the people who want to be on the sluttier end of the spectrum or the more open end of the spectrum of how they live their lives in relationships. But I'm not a therapist. I'm not a certified counselor, and I don't deal with any deeper seated issues, whether individual or couple or relationship based. And so when people will come to me with some of these issues, I'll say, that's something that you need to work with an actual therapist with. And I always recommend shopping around like you would shop around for anything else. Go and see 3-4 different people once and then see who you like the best and who you connect with the most.
And there's a bunch of different kinds of professionals that might be helpful. Let's say to any given couple, you might see, a psychiatrist, a clinical psychologist, a social worker, a counselor, a life coach. There's a whole smorgasbord of different kinds of people, but they're siloed. So like if you see a clinical psych PhD and you go, it's not really working with you, can you give a referral to someone else? They typically won't refer you to a life coach. They'll refer you to some other clinical psych person.
Right.
So you have to be aware of getting siloed prematurely.
So yesterday I went to your Sexceptional lecture. We had a little trivia as well, which was very entertaining. And you were talking about some common popular psych advice that they give to couples. And I was really surprised by the stuff that you presented that's commonly thought to help couples out, but really doesn't.
And so you want to talk about
Share
that?
some of that.
Yeah, because I was shocked. Yeah.
Well, so one of the things that we talked about was this idea that more sex will necessarily make you happier. A lot of people think that they're not having enough sex, that they're not measuring up because we live in a society where we see sex all around us. And so we think other people are doing it more than we are. But if you look at the research, when people force themselves to have more sex just for the sake of doing it, it doesn't make them happier. It actually makes them less happy in the end. It actually makes them want sex less than they did before because it's not good. It's reducing their intrinsic motivation to want to have sex. So that's one of those ideas that, it's widely held, but the research doesn't back it up at all.
That's such an interesting finding, and I would not expected that. And it just anecdotally, I know a man who recently said to his wife, "I'll move heaven and earth for you if you have sex with me every day." And they kind of agreed to do some different things, and their relationship seems much better. But it seems like if a therapist says, you guys have to double the amount of sex you're having, one thing that might happen, it just occurred to me, is that you're not really sure who the burden is on to do that more. And so it becomes like a chore rather than one person who is saying, I'm actually going to do more for you if you have more sex with me, which I think might work better. I'm not sure, though.
And I think having more sex as a goal could be okay, but when you put a specific number on it, and it's like, we need to have sex this amount of times per month, that's not a good way to approach it, because then you're just shooting for a number rather than, trying to do what feels natural. And people like spontaneous sex, and that's one of the things that they often feel is missing in their sex life. And so when you're forcing it to go through the motions, that usually never ends up well.
Yeah, I was surprised when you operationalized it. They said said double the amount of sex that you're having, which could mean a lot of things, right?
It could be. For the average person, they're doing it about once a week.
Yeah.
So, you're talking about going up to twice a week. But even that, I think a lot of people would hear that and say, well, that doesn't sound like that much. But for these people, it was a really hard goal to achieve.
Yeah, but it puts pressure on you to perform, and sex is not very fun under pressure.
Pressure always makes it worse.
Yeah.
And then it leads to performance issues.
Unless you want the pressure. But with the example that you're giving, I think that came from this very authentic place for this person who wasn't getting as much as he wanted to.
Yeah.
Right? Like he wanted to have sex every day. And so for him, that was very much like, let's get it to the level that I would love it to be. Whereas for these couples, it was, they had gotten to whatever level that they wanted it to be. And then researchers were telling them, okay, now double it.
So it seems like there's a general issue that there's academic sex research and relationship research, and then there's clinical practice. And often the state of the art in research either doesn't trickle down at all to what clinicians are actually telling people to do, or trickles down quite slowly, or there are clinicians who actively resist the research findings because they have a particular personal, political, ideological sort of bias that interferes. Mm-hmm. And I imagine that that's pretty opaque to the general public and not widely known. Like you sort of trust if you go to your doctor and they're saying, you've got this condition, this is my diagnosis, this is my recommended course of treatment, that they kind of more or less know what they're talking about.
That they're following the latest research for that.
Right. And we know that actually
treatment.
That's not the case in sort of medical health care, but maybe even to a greater extent, it's not the case in counseling and therapy and so forth.
I actually think it might be more the case in regular sort of physical health care because of all the sort of medicine, right? All the drugs that the drug companies want to sell. And because that is often the only course of treatment for physical health issues, they will come to the doctors and let them know about these new drugs. So at least you're aware of the new drug treatments that are going on. Whereas with psychological issues, unless you're a psychiatrist who can prescribe medications, all of these other people that you mentioned, the clinical psych, the PhDs, the social workers, the life coaches, the psychoanalysts, all of those people cannot prescribe medications. So they don't have that sort of external force coming to them and letting them know. They would have to be informed out of their own interest. Of course, there's a CE, the continuing education kind of built-in expectation and program, and probably Justin knows a little bit more about how that works. But even within that, you have a lot of leeway in terms of how you choose to get your continuing education credits.
And yeah, so if you're a big pharma company and you have a great new drug and it works really, really well, you can patent it immediately, make billions of dollars on it. If you invent some awesome new kind of role play that could really help millions of couples, you can't patent it. You can't monetize it quite as easily. You could certainly, establish a training institute and have continuing education credits and help therapists kind of get the message out, but it's a much slower process. It's much more
and less
dicey,
universal,
and it's not very well organized nationally. And
there's also another issue that we haven't talked about yet, which is, we're kind of assuming that people can access care, and there's a lot of people who don't have insurance or the ability to go see a therapist, and they might have a limited number of visits they can do per year. And so even shopping around and finding the right person would be a burden on them. So the access to care is an issue, and that leads a lot of people to seek out pop psych books as the solution. And those books are even less informed by the science and research, which is kind of why a lot of us do what we do in terms of being engaged with the public. Is we see this need there to get the information to the public that's either not getting to them through their therapists or their doctors, because doctors don't necessarily receive more sex ed. In fact, on average, it's 10 hours over 4 years of med school pertaining to sex ed. That's not very much. And so, we see all these people going to pop psych books for advice, and the advice is just often terrible. And I know a lot of us want to correct that.
So, Justin, you do a blog on sex and psychology. When you see kind of mainstream, men's magazines, women's magazines, and you're just kind of casually flipping through Cosmo or Esquire, Men's Health or whatever, sort of what percentage of the claims or advice do you go, oh my God, that's really wrong, that's very misguided? What percent of the time do you go, that's great, that's actually pretty solid?
I've never actually put a number on it, but then again, I'm also all quoted in all of those magazines with some frequency. And I have some colleagues who swear off talking to some of those magazines because they say, they publish a lot of misinformation and I don't want to be associated with that. My view is that if they don't talk to me, then they're going to talk to somebody who probably knows less than I do. And the result is that they're not going to get as accurate or reliable or scientifically informed information. So whenever I get those media requests, I respond to them and I do it promptly because I want to try and fill that information void as much as I can. And I know that my information goes in sometimes with a mix of questionable information, but the reality is that these are very widely read publications, and this is one way I can get that work out there.
Because they are going to publish that piece with or without you.
And it's appalling when you are on the phone with somebody talking to them and then they manage to say that you said something that you never said. That's sometimes why it's better to answer via email, even though it's much easier to hop on the phone with somebody. Because if they get your transcription wrong, it's bizarre, right?
I always do email interviews if I can, because, and the reason I do it is because there was one time where I opened up a magazine and there was a quote from me that was the lead line in the article, and I never said it. It was just totally made up. I don't remember what the quote was. The good news is that it actually sounded good.
Okay, good.
But it was made up. But that just made me realize, like, I've got to be careful with this, and having some type of transcript I think is important.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting into kind of how all the sex research gets translated into the popular media as opposed to clinicians and therapists.
Yeah. So you had a very popular paper, especially with conservatives. They just loved it. You and Dan Savage and David Ley, right?
Yes, we published a paper on the phenomenon of cuckolding, which is when people are aroused by the idea of watching their partner have sex with someone else. Our paper was specifically on gay men who are into this practice, but lots of people are into it regardless of gender and orientation. And one of my co-authors, David Ley, wrote a whole book on it called Insatiable Wives, and it's about heterosexual men who get off on the idea of watching their girlfriend or wife have sex with another man. And so we did the study kind of looking at how does this play out in a gay context, and then also how does it affect their relationship. And one of the key things we found was that most people who tried it really liked it and said that it improved their relationship. Only 5% of our participants said that it did not meet their expectations, right? So people who did it liked it. And then CNN, wrote up our research, and they ran this headline that said, cuckolding can be good for some couples, the study says. And people did not like that, it turns out.
What happened?
So when it first came out, there was a big reaction on Twitter. People started calling CNN the Cuckold News Network, which was kind of funny. But then people started, tweeting all these things saying that this was immoral, this was wrong. I distinctly remember this tweet that said that our research and our paper and CNN's coverage of it was, quote, destroying Western civilization, which, I mean, I'm putting that on my CV now.
The same study's been done in straight couples too, or is it only, yeah?
And you find the same thing, that straight couples who are into it are happy as well.
Yeah,
right? That's why people do it.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like there's a general issue that whenever you do any sex research that is actually purely descriptive, that says, hey, this is what people do, this is what they like, and it hits the media, it immediately gets moralized and interpreted as if you're approving of the practice or you're supporting it or trying to promote it. And I think the public reaction to that kind of thing goes all the way back at least to Alfred Kinsey publishing, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and Human Female, late 40s, early 50s, where he was kind of just holding up a mirror to American sexuality and saying, hey, look, people masturbate a lot, and a lot of people have homosexual desires, and a lot of people cheat and see sex workers and whatever. And there was also a massive freak out, as if he was sort of condoning, supporting, propagating all of this stuff. And, social conservatives seem like they're quite primed to react to any given piece of sex research as a threat. But also on the political left, a lot of people think, well, just because a practice is popular, that validates it as good and ethical. Mm-hmm. How often do you see this kind of conflation of like description and prescription, or what is and what should be?
It's a hard question, Miller.
Right. I surprised myself with where that went.
I mean, all the time, because what people tend to think is we have this sort of environmentalist view. So the idea is that culture inflicts itself upon us, and then if we believe something is normative, then that's going to make it happen. So all these people have been talking about how different cultural influences have changed things really markedly. So even if you think that there is a bunch of people who are really into cuckoldry, if you publish a paper saying that it's true, then the idea is that you're going to make lots of other people do it, right? When in fact the reason that it's popular is for evolutionary reasons in the first place. You know, there's an evolutionary psychology reason for it. And even if you just think about men watching normal porn, why do men like to see images of men having sex with other women? That is an indication. It's not that anybody told men this is the kind of thing you should watch and get aroused by. It's a natural, inclination that people have. And then you see something similar on a more left-leaning aspect, which is that if I say men and women differ in this way, people will say that's a normative claim, and that's going to propagate that. So you see that on the both sides of that issue.
Yeah, I think when you have descriptive data that this is how it is, then the people who like that's how that this exists, they're going to take that and interpret it as, and that's how it should be, and that's how everybody should be. And those people who don't like that exists, they take it on and spin it their own way, saying you're pushing something that is going to be the end of Western civilization. So I think that's a pretty normal human reaction to have to some of these data coming out. I wish we all could have a more, reasoned approach or more moderate approach that, okay, this is something that some people do, and for them it seems like it's working out, and that doesn't mean I need to do it. That doesn't mean it's good in and of itself. That doesn't mean that everybody who does it or who tries it is going to enjoy it. That there are all these, well, it depends.
And I think that's the way that we all tend to approach things, is that we take the very nuanced perspective. Right. And that is the approach that we try to give, not just in the research, but whenever we talk about it publicly, is that different things work for different people. And just because some people find this to be arousing or it works for them and makes them happier, that doesn't mean that you have to try that, or that you have to do anything differently, or that you have to like it in any way.
I think the conservatives' response to some of these sex research findings that we all have come up with or have found in our data is actually less surprising to me than some of the outrage and rejection of research topics and research findings from some of the people on the left, actually. And that's, I find that a lot more interesting in a way, a lot more surprising, that we've seen lately. There have been a number of different topics of research that, or research studies coming out where the liberal left was very much up in arms about. One example that I can think of is the gaydar data by Michal Kosinski out of Stanford, where finding that an algorithm that you can basically, he found that basically you can teach an algorithm to distinguish between gay and straight faces. And the response to that was not just that this is, not that the research was bad in and of itself, but that we shouldn't be studying this, for one. This is a bad topic of research, that because this can have bad applications, and that goes back to him being a homophobe, because he would even come up with a topic to study that could potentially have these terrible applicative,
Yeah, so sexuality is just highly moralized and politicized, maybe particularly in America and particularly now. And it seems like it's very hard to convince the public that they should get away from the mindset of, a finding comes out, it's reported in the media. Often the first reaction is, is this good for us or bad for us? Is this good for my political tribe or not? Is this undermining my values or not? Hopefully the better response would be, hey, isn't that interesting? Is it true? Does it sound like it's good research? And not to have that knee-jerk kind of reaction that's like very tribal and very focused on jumping to the immediate kind of societal implications. Like, even if that was true, what would happen if it became generally known?
So as someone who's taught college students for a decade, one of the lessons I always teach them is that science is not here to make us feel good. It's not here to validate our beliefs. It's the attempt is to find the truth and see what's actually going on in the world and to describe it. And I find that when you use that message, that tends to work in terms of helping college students to get it. And an example that I always give my students that was a really formative part of my training as a scientist was I went to a conference. I think it was very early on in my graduate career, and Lisa Diamond was giving a talk on her research on sexual fluidity. And this was before it had really made it big and before she had published her book on it. And I approached her after her talk and I said, are you concerned about the, implications of your findings? This idea that people's sexual attractions and identities can change over the course of their lifespan. I could see how some people might interpret that as maybe sexual orientation is a choice, right? And Lisa's response to me as a young graduate student, I love it. I always think of it and I appreciate her so much for this, was to tell me, she said, I wake up worrying about that every day, about ways that people might misconstrue or misinterpret my research for political purposes, but this is what the data say, and I can't hide it just because it might have potentially uncomfortable implications. And so that really resonated with me, and that's the example that I always give my students in talking about why we need to use science as a quest for truth rather than something that just makes us feel good.
So we go ahead, Dr. Fleischman.
I just think that when you were talking about that, Lisa Diamond's work definitely showed that women have this fluidity, but men do not.
Actually.
You think
actually? So Lisa, we invited her to give a talk at a conference a few years later for the SPSP Sexuality pre-conference.
I was going to react to the same thing. Yeah, when her talk was, what was it titled?
The title of her talk was, I was wrong. Men are pretty darn sexually fluid too.
Yep.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And she presented some data on men, right? Daily diary, I think, data or weekly diary data, where they did show a fair amount of fluidity, not as much as women, but they did show a fair amount.
And I love when scientists can admit that they're wrong. And that's
really cool.
One of my favorite science blogs is written by Samin Vazir, and her blog is called Sometimes I'm Wrong. Yeah. And I just love it that, and this is what a scientist should be, is somebody who's not committed to an ideology, not committed to a particular belief system. You're always open to the evidence and the data and where it takes you.
Yeah,
and
that's the beauty of science, that it is self-corrective
if you do it right.
If you do it right and you don't have the ego that says, this is what it is, and no matter what new data comes out. And some people are like that. I mean, we certainly know scientists who've had their theory ever since they were in their late 20s, early 30s, and then all the work that they've done has been to support it and suppress all the evidence of the contrary and fight everybody and anybody who might publish data that's not. So we're flawed humans, but I think the scientific process.
Yeah, I think there's this weird spillover from the political realm where a politician is expected to stay consistent to a particular policy position kind of throughout their whole career. And if they change their minds based on evidence, that's called flip-flopping, and that's seen as a bad thing. When I teach human sexuality, I often will tell students in a particular lecture, hey, when I taught this 5 years ago, I took this line and I was sort of advancing this claim, and now I've changed my mind. Here's why. And the students actually love that. They love seeing kind of intellectual humility and adaptiveness and flexibility. And I think most scientists get that, and they understand that actually people are fascinated by other people who can actually change their minds given evidence. But I think journalists don't always understand that. And I think, I don't know, maybe even clinicians and therapists are kind of reluctant, maybe if they have a couple in therapy, to say, I was giving you guys this advice 2 weeks ago. I just read this new paper. Sorry, that was wrong. Hope you guys didn't take it too seriously. Here's what I recommend now.
Here's a question. What is your favorite thing that you taught in psychology of human sexuality that you can't teach the way you taught anymore? Like, what's your favorite finding that you can't talk about anymore?
My favorite story was about the history of the vibrator. right? This idea of
Too
hysteria.
fun.
Yeah, right. The hysteria idea that doctors used, that the reason the vibrator was invented was because you had all these women who were diagnosed with this debunked medical diagnosis called hysteria, which was, basically this way of saying when women wanted sex too much, like, they needed to be masturbated to orgasm by their doctors with this vibrator, and they invented the vibrator to cut down on the length of office visits because it took too long for them to do it by hand.
Yeah, poor doctors and their hands.
Yeah. So this claim was published in a book called The Technology of Orgasm, and it made waves, and it even made it into my human sexuality textbook.
Yeah, we all taught. I mean, I taught it. Yeah.
And now it turns out the story's BS. Like, it's not true. And so in the next edition of my textbook, I have to take that out, and I also have to include a section to say, I was wrong based on the evidence. This did not actually happen.
What's your favorite that you've changed your mind about?
I don't have one.
I
off the
love
top of my
two
head.
things that I don't teach anymore. Ovulatory effects, the idea that women's changes are, they prefer more masculine faces, they prefer men with more swagger. So that stuff is now under contention. It may be true, it might not be true. I saw an amazing fireworks display between Marty Hazelton and Steve Gengestad at Lars Penke at the latest conference where there was this, I'll show you. I took video surreptitiously that I will not post. But yeah, I took video of it. It's really, really amazing. But I don't teach it anymore because the nuance makes my head spin. And in 10 years, when it's all sorted out, maybe.
I teach it by saying these are all the effects that we have found in some studies, but there is a lot of contest. I sort of let people know. I let my students know that these are contested results and that they might see it because some people might still report on it and whatever. They might see it somewhere. So I let them know that this is a thing. This is an ongoing debate.
The other finding that I love, but some people have told me is probably BS because it's never replicated, is that more homophobic men get harder for gay porn.
I thought there was a recent replication
There
of
was.
that.
Yeah, I remember. Relatively recent, yeah.
Really? Okay. Because people really love that finding. And somebody told me that either they themselves or they knew somebody who tried to replicate it, didn't find the same thing.
And it may, and there are always replications that aren't published. And
That's right. Yeah.
It would be great to see a meta-analysis on that topic to know kind of what the
original
is there.
paper was definitely from a Freudian reaction formation kind of model, and certainly it doesn't really. I mean, the Freudian model doesn't really seem to carry any weight anymore. So, from a theoretical perspective, why would we expect that to be the case? And yeah, I mean, you might expect it in a subset of men. I'm not sure.
Right.
But something else is that original study was also published in the 1980s, which
That's
was
right.
a very different time for acceptance of homosexuality. And so if you're repeating it or replicating it today, you might not get the same pattern of results just because gay people feel more able to come out. And so maybe
you don't have all these in the
Closet.
closet. Yeah.
I mean, certainly closet homosexuals are still a thing.
Yeah.
I had the same precious little lecture material that I had to give up as both of you, the whole invention of the vibrator to deal with orgasm. I actually assigned the movie Hysteria, which is a sort of highly fictionalized biopic based on what turns out to be a highly fictionalized book, promoting that. The way I teach ovulatory cycle effects is now I sort of say, look, this set of results seems not to be replicating very well, like women at peak fertility favoring the good genes indicators like the masculinized faces and the assertive personalities, but these other findings do seem to replicate, I think, so far pretty well, to kind of give the students a sense of the nuance that you don't always want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Certain results in an area can replicate and others don't. And there might be interesting theoretical reasons for that. But I think more generally what happens with me having taught human sexuality for way too long, like 20 or 30 years, is I keep realizing, there's whole areas of sexuality that I knew very little about, actually, and I was teaching it from kind of a position of pretty strong ignorance. Like, I really knew very little about polyamory, open relationships, swinging, consensual and non-monogamy until the last 5 years. So I covered it hardly at all, but when I did cover it, it was probably in a pretty ignorant and biased way. Same with kink, but also the same with kind of sex positive Christian perspectives on relationships. Like I read a whole bunch of books last summer of Christian marriage advice, and a lot of it's very biblical based, but it's kind of like the Bible meets self-help meets secondhand sex research. But honestly, it wasn't that much worse than a lot of mainstream pop psychology. And I thought, oh my God, yeah, like so I ran the poll. A lot of my students are Christian. A lot of them are fairly socially conservative Catholics, because University of New Mexico is about 45% Hispanic students. And they tend to be Catholic, socially conservative. And I had no idea how their faith intersected with like how I was teaching sexuality, often in a way that was probably fairly alienating to them. So I kind of try to update not just the research I present, but also how I kind of make it relatable to particular kinds of students.
So I had an interesting career trajectory in teaching human sexuality, because the first sexuality courses I taught were as a graduate student at Purdue University, which is in a small town in Indiana. And so it selects for a more conservative student base. And so that's where I learned how to teach human sexuality. My next job was at Colorado State. I was there for a few years. The student population was fairly similar, but then I went to Harvard for 3 years after that, and it was a very left-leaning student base. And I thought that teaching human sexuality was kind of like my bread and butter, because I always got these really high evaluations for it. And I actually got among the lowest evaluations of my career the first time I taught it there. It was because the students there had a very different perspective, were much more sensitive to language and the way that things were described. And so for me, that was a real learning experience, going from teaching a more conservative student base to a more liberal student base, and figuring out how to teach sexuality in those two sorts of environments. And I think that was really important for me as somebody whose career now is in communicating about sex, is how do I make this accessible to diverse audience with different political backgrounds who are just coming from those radically different perspectives.
Was it mostly because of the language that you had used, or was it about the content of what you were talking about?
A lot of it was language. I didn't have so much with content, but yeah. And so for me, that was, how do I reframe everything that I'm talking about?
Give us an example.
Well, everything relating to gender was an issue. And so for me, it was more about, how do I adjust the way that I'm explaining things to make this, to make it so that my audience doesn't shut down at the first thing that I've said.
What was this, 5 years ago, 6 years ago?
This was 2011 to 14.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that is during the time when a lot of the gender stuff was happening in our society, a lot of changes around language. I mean, around gender and transgender language, and how we talk about it, what we do with it was changing. Mm-hmm. And those changes were happening in the more liberal parts of the country. So it makes perfect sense that someone teaching conservative students who had no awareness of any of those changes or no care of some of those changes happening.
Yeah, and as someone who grew up in Ohio and then taught sex in Indiana, I had a limited kind of perspective on how other people talked about things, and so it was very useful as an educator to have that experience.
So we've all, taught human sexuality for at least a little while, and my impression is, when I was teaching maybe 10 years ago, I was mostly worried at a very low level that the socially conservative students would not necessarily complain about the class, but just kind of drop it and quietly drift away, and that I wouldn't be reaching them. Now I feel much more terrified that teaching human sexuality is an absolutely reckless thing to do as an academic, and the thing most likely to get you in trouble, apart from Twitter, and that I really have to sort of appease or pander to the sort of social justice activist students and the small percentage of them who are kind of very interested in the exact language I use and what kind of ideological biases I'm expressing. Is that your experience as well, or are you kind of equally worried about, conservative and lefty students?
I teach a NYU, and there are very few conservative students that I end up teaching. So it's a very, very self-selected group.
Do you get in trouble very much?
I haven't gotten in trouble yet.
I was surprised that I never got in trouble either. So at my university, they were saying the third year students, there's only 3 years at that university in the UK, at all universities in the UK. And so those students, they were saying we need a third year unit that a lot of students will take because there's one thing being offered and only 10 students signed up. They're just offering it in the full professor's office. And these students, you know, we need to make value for money. And I was like, I have an idea of something that would be popular for students to take. So I had 200 students the last time I taught psychology of human sexuality. And I teach very broadly, right? So I teach about Ray Blanchard. I teach about sex differences from an evolutionary perspective. But I also teach about BDSM and kink and romance novels. And I talk about prostitution in largely positive terms. And so there's a lot of stuff to get offended about. And surprisingly, I've never gotten in trouble for it. And I've had trans students, because I talk about how people identify as genders that are, you know, different than the sex that they were born, or what they now say as assigned at birth. And so I've had people say, oh, it's really great that they pointed that out, that there is masculine and femininity, you know, that's societally. But yeah, surprisingly. And I just think that the UK, the students, it's just not as hot a political area. And even though I don't end up usually putting it on the exam, I also teach my students about contraception and STIs. And I try to undo in my class some of the, frankly, overreaction about how dangerous sexually transmitted infections are. Yeah, the stigma. You know, I grew up in Georgia and, you know, in the suburbs. And I remember this lady came in to talk to us, and she showed us how big an HIV viral particle was and how big a hole in a condom was. And the implication was that the viral particle could get through the hole in the condom. And I was like, doesn't it have to be suspended in some kind of liquid? If the condom is watertight, the virus can't just like mosey on through the hole. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And she was trying to scare the shit out of us, right? And so when I tell my students, actually, a man who has sex with a woman who's HIV positive has a 1 in 2,500 chance of contracting it from her. A woman, a 1 in 1,500 chance. They're like, whoa, you know. So these are the kinds of topics that I think are important. And I would just ask you guys, what's something that you teach your students more for kind of life strategy reasons or how to live a good life reasons than actually teaching about the subject of human sexuality?
But I also wanted to, going back to Geoffrey's question around like sort of getting in trouble. I've tried to be, from the very beginning, from the very first class in the course, be very kind of upfront about language, that language changes, that I try to be on top of the most recent changes as much as I can, but that that's not always possible, and that different subcultures use different words and different concepts, and that we try to, and I will often include some of the terms that have been used in past research and that are no longer considered, you know, safe to use or kosher in some communities. So I kind of, I try to bring awareness to these issues so that I don't know.
One of my colleagues got mad at me for using the word homosexual, and she said that was a stigmatizing word now. And I just think that if somebody's going to read a paper of mine in 50 years, hopefully, that if I use the newer words, if I use the word homosexual, I just think it's got more longevity as a term than perhaps some other words that are now in vogue. And this is the kind of stuff that I think about is, you know, if the language changes so fast, how can we have consistency in how we describe scientific findings? Yeah.
And that's one of the issues that I often encountered in the classes I would teach would be that the language the students was using is different than the language the scientists are using, and then they think the science is therefore biased. And so I very much take the same approach that you do in terms of framing it about how language is evolving. But I also try to make it clear to the students that, you know, there's a scientific lexicon that doesn't necessarily match up with what people today are saying.
Doesn't change as quickly.
It takes
right?
science time to catch up. And so for me, figuring out how to frame that and explain that to students was really important. And so, my first semester when I was teaching at Harvard, I got lower evaluations, but by the time I left, I was getting teaching awards. And it's because I figured out how to frame it and approach it to that different audience. And now every time I'm talking about sex, I'm thinking about what are the different ways that a conservative audience and a liberal audience is going to perceive this, and parse my use of language, and how do I say this most effectively. And I'm glad that you brought up, the word homosexual, because I know I mentioned earlier closeted homosexuals. And as soon as I said that, I cringed because I'm like, I know that there are certain people who would listen to this and would say, well, therefore he is homophobic because he used that term. And so it's, I try to be as careful as I possibly can, but also make it clear that I'm not perfect.
Yeah. And the kind of most recent thing, and I was teaching about biological development and sex differences. And I just said to my students, I said, if I say people with penises and people with vaginas, we will be here literally all day.
I know. It takes a lot more words.
It's a lot more words. And I mean, I just think that there's a certain trade-off with efficiency that I'm not willing to make. Unless it's really important, to be inclusive in that context. Yeah.
Yeah, there's language to communicate, and then there's language to virtue signal. And virtue signaling usually requires a lot more syllables. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's kind of wrap up within, 5 minutes or so, and talk maybe about the future of sex research, sex education, and sort of where young people are getting their information from at the moment. It seems like my students are mostly getting their information about sexuality from an ungodly mishmash of like high school sex education, which they all say sucks and didn't teach them anything apart from be frightened of STDs. And their parents, who they all say were too nervous to even have the talk in any constructive way. And they've all seen porn, and they're all ashamed of it. But they've learned a lot about sex from that, but it's pretty biased and weird and partial.
Inaccurate.
And then, sort of pop science as it trickles down into magazine articles, blogs, YouTube, whatever. Do you think there are any emerging ways to communicate that might fill some of those holes and make it better? Because at the moment, it feels like the human sexuality class in college is really the only formal, systematic exposure that most Americans get to any of this information.
Online courses that would basically be the human sexuality class that any of us could teach at a university. I think creating those and making those as available as possible, as popular as possible out there is one way.
And there are also a lot of people in the sort of sex tech space who are creating apps and other tools that are designed to fill that void in sex education. And they're trying to do it science-based. They're consulting with the scientists in creating those products. And so it may be that there's going to be more good tools out there that people can access at some point, but they're still kind of very early on in getting to market.
And YouTube. Yeah.
YouTube.
There's some good stuff on YouTube. There's a surprisingly popular video about basically how to take care of a vagina, vaginal hygiene, misconceptions that people have, things like douching, wearing tight polyester underwear, bathing suits, stuff that your mom might have tried to teach you but didn't know everything about. Mm-hmm. And these are the kinds of things that people can access in the privacy of their own homes. They don't have to ask any painful questions of anybody. And this kind of stuff is really the starting point. And then you can get to more varsity level stuff about sexual fantasies and consideration of your partner. But really, I think the basics are super important. And as I said, stuff about STIs is even wrong. How are we going to teach more complicated stuff?
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little worried, speaking about the future of sex research, I'm a little worried. I don't know if you all are worried, and I would love to hear everybody's view on that. And I know Justin and I are often at the same conferences in the same research circles. I don't know if you go to the evolutionary psych side of things. I don't think you do, do you? But then the two of you are in the evolutionary psych. And so maybe there's sort of two different experiences around this, but I've been noticing more and more in the last few years at some of the sex research conferences, there being a lot of resistance from certain segments of that population toward doing some types of sex research because they don't like some of the political implications of that, or because they don't think that we should be studying certain things. And many of those actually have to do with gender, what Justin brought up, and certain types of transgender kind of theories and causes and ideas. And I've been seeing a lot of silencing of talks and researchers who are doing that research. I mean, literally people shouting over presentations because they didn't like what was being said. And a lot of other people saying people should just simply not study this at all. Not that they're not interested in it, that they don't want to study it, but that nobody should be studying certain issues. And that's a little worrying to me when some of that resistance is coming not from sort of the standard conservative, don't do any sex research, anything, but from within our own circles.
Yeah.
And so have you seen that in the evolutionary psych?
Well, so
things?
I was invited to give a talk at a conference because I did some stuff on bisexuality, and it was called Born This Way, and Gerald Frieger was there. And Gerald Frieger's done some really interesting stuff looking at how gender nonconforming people who grow up to be gay or lesbian are when they're children, with videos and with photos. And there was an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist guy there, and he disagreed with even labeling or marking on a scale how masculine or feminine somebody is. He's like, what does that even mean? That's socially constructed. And so I think people who think that gender dysphoria is very painful, or people who think that being stigmatized when you're a child for what will ultimately probably be your sexual orientation, gay men tend to have more feminine typical interests when they're children, and then yet they don't report that themselves. Other people report that because it was so stigmatized, they forget it, right? So I think that if you have a problem with even saying gay men when they're children tend to have more feminine typical interests, girls who grow up to be lesbians tend to have a masculine typical interest, if even that is beyond the pale, then I agree with you. It doesn't really seem like we're going to be able to discover very much.
I worry a lot that, who's supporting sex research at the moment? It's extremely hard to get federal research grants to study sexuality. You usually have to bundle it into some other federal grant application to allegedly study something else, and you tack on the sex questionnaire and the physiological research as a sort of add-on extra. Even if that's the main point of the research, you kind of have to smuggle it in, because often you'll have U.S. senators, getting up in arms about how dare we use taxpayer money to study the thing that's the most important thing in human lives, right? And then you have sort of private research institutes that almost always have some kind of political or religious bias. Like they're almost always pro-porn or anti-porn, pro-family values, anti-family values. There are very few neutral, large sources of funding. And then you have this problem of sex researchers censoring each other and not even having a kind of unified view of how science should work. And, I don't know if American sex education, sex research has much of a future compared to, say, I don't know, some other countries that might become a little bit more sexually liberal. I mean, China is surging ahead in all kinds of research areas. I'm not sure Chinese sex research is going to be at the forefront anytime soon.
Not anytime soon, I don't think, but maybe Europe?
It could evaporate. I mean, German sex research was at the forefront of the world from about, the 1870s to the early 1930s, right, until the Nazis came to power. And one of the first things that they did was shut down Magnus Hirschfeld's Sex Research Institute. So there's a kind of lefty narrative that says throughout history, it's the social conservatives who attack sex research, and we would never do that. But I think at the moment, it's a complicated landscape.
What do you see, Justin? You can have the final word.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reason for concern. And there's also just the general public concern. I find when I post certain articles, for example, if I blog about the purpose of the female orgasm and I talk about different theories of it as to why it might have evolved, every time I post an article on the topic, I get several people who comment and say, this doesn't need an answer, right? Why do we even need to ask this question? And that I find to be very troubling. That, these are not researchers who are saying that. This is just general people who might follow my work and say that these questions just shouldn't be asked. And so you get that within our field, you get it from the public, you get it from the politicians, and then there's not the money to do the work. And then you also just, if you work in academics, there's a generally devaluing of sex research and sex education. As somebody who teaches a human sexuality course, I've always had to make the case for the value of the courses I teach. Because a lot of people think it's just really easy and students will take it just because it's a sex class and they'll give you high evaluations just because of that. And it's honestly the hardest class you can possibly teach, I think, because there are so many political minefields you can step on every single day. And just as a funny little side story, I don't know how funny it is, but when I was at Harvard and I was teaching the human sexuality course, it actually hadn't been taught there for several years before I came. And so there was this pent up student demand. And so all these students were signing up to take my course. And I overheard a conversation one day where a high status professor there was very upset that students weren't taking his class and that they were taking mine instead, because mine is the fluff course. It's the sex course. And, it's something I've always had to, you always have to make the case for yourself, and you're always fighting against those stereotypes. That's, like sex isn't important. And it's honestly the most important thing in a lot of people's lives.
There's something qualitatively different though, between sort of belittling it or thinking it as a fluff thing and not getting enough respect, and also maybe not getting enough respect or support from the outside. There's something really scary and qualitatively different when you have silencing from within.
Yeah. And when your colleagues don't even appreciate, just the value of sex education, like that's a whole other issue.
Yeah. It seems like, at least there's enough data to make the case that, number one, a lot of people report having sex is when they feel happiest, and it's sort of the most fulfilling and rewarding thing in human life. Number two, that in terms of, at least long-term relationships, it's really important to couple satisfaction and how marriages develop. It's how we literally create the next generation, at least until we have artificial wombs and stuff. And so its centrality to human life seems like something that all sex researchers should be able to sign up to. But even that gets politicized in weird ways. So I don't want to leave on a down on a down note, but I think on the upside, there's so many ways for young people and even middle-aged people now to kind of circumvent the mainstream media hegemony and even parts of the censoriousness within sex research to find their own path and to, find a video course that addresses a particular topic, or find the YouTube channel that, really resonates with them, or listen to Dan Savage's podcasts, or read Justin's blogs or whatever. So there's a diversification of information sources that makes it harder for any one interest group to sort of dominate and control. But it also makes for a very confusing information landscape. And one goal of this little conversation that we're having, I hope, is to try to give the ordinary listener kind of a little more insight into the inner world of sex research and sex education.
Cool. So let's just, at the end, just say, where can you find out more information about each of us? The information's all going to be down below. Justin, where can I find out more about you?
I run a blog called Sex and Psychology at sexandpsychology.com. And it has links to my books, social media channels, and I also blog about the latest sex research 3 times a week, every week, and I have done so for 8 years now.
Awesome.
Consistency is key.
Yes.
Yeah, and Dr. Zhana, who I realized I had the accent on the wrong syllable on your last name. You're Vrangalova.
Vrangalova.
Yeah, not Vrangalova, which
okay,
is how
all Americans all Americans pronounce it like that. It's okay. I've gotten used to it. Luckily, nobody out there has to spell my last name in order to find me, because that'd be very difficult to find. So it's Dr. Zhana, DRZHANA, on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and that's my website, drzhana.com. And I also run another website called the casualsexproject.com, where people can post their true stories of hookups and read about other people's hookup experiences.
It's a good read. And I'm Diana Fleischman. You can find me at Sentientist on Twitter, and I have some other things brewing. And Geoffrey Miller, where can we find you?
Geoffrey Miller, I've got a website, primalpoly.com. I tweet as primalpoly. And I've got a YouTube channel, which is pretty easy to find, Geoffrey Miller, PhD. Right and you're probably watching me either on my channel or Justin's channel or something. And yeah, there's like interwebs, and you can Google search us all, and we're pretty easy to find because we make the effort to reach out to people like you.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for watching.